The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello and welcome back, everybody. Before we get into tonight's stories, as we always say, go check out our sources in our show notes. There's lots of links to the information that we used, and you can use those to learn more about the topics that we're covering in tonight's episode.
And without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. So sit back, get comfy, and Beth, why don't you get us started?
As the triumphant Norse warrior emerged from the Balkan cave, he carried a creature so extraordinary that the other warriors gasped. Its skin was pink, almost translucent. Its eyeless head was pear-shaped with strange frills, and it tapered into an elongated snout. Despite its long, serpent-like body, it had 4 tiny legs, with 3 toes on each of its front legs and 2 toes on each of its back legs. No one gazing upon the incredible creature had any doubt. It had to be the offspring of a lindworm, the terrifying Cave Wyrm. Lindworms were legendary creatures, a sort of serpent-dragon hybrid that were known to guard treasure by day in its cavernous lair and sneak into churchyards to steal corpses at night. Maybe this baby lindworm meant that the 7-headed serpent was real. The 7-headed serpent was said to demand the sacrifice of 12 males and 12 maidens every year, or it would destroy the country. The 7-headed serpent always slept with warning bells placed around it so that no one could ever get close enough to slay it. After many years, the king's son wouldn't put up with it anymore, so he managed to sneak into the serpent's palace, quietly stuff cotton into each of the bells, and cut off each of the serpent's 7 heads. But maybe this small creature was one of its babies. Or maybe this strange living creature meant that Nidhogg was undoubtedly real, the monstrous serpent that was trapped beneath the world tree and gnawed on its roots. When Ragnarok, or the end of the world, comes, Nidhogg will finally rise up from the earth, bringing an army of the dead to fight with him. Maybe this creature proved that Ragnarok was coming. Even today, it would be easy to see why anyone would think that this creature the warrior held in his hands was a baby lindworm or dragon. It does look exactly like one. Plus, it's a real creature. But to get from how a mythical dragon got to be a real living animal, we have to start at the beginning, in Germanic folklore. So, to start off, in European folklore, the word dragon and the word worm, spelled W-Y-R-M, were interchangeable. Plus, they also had drakes and wyverns. Confused yet? I'm going to try and break it down. Dragons have 4 legs and wings. Drakes have 4 legs, but no wings. Wyverns had 2 legs and wings, and worms have no legs and no wings. AllThat'sInteresting.com explains it a little further by saying that worms, or cave worms, which sound way more terrifying, did not breathe fire either. So they were these massive serpent-like creatures with sharp scales. They hoarded and guarded treasure in their many caves and often lurked in marshes, where they could snatch both sheep and innocent maidens. Plus, they were highly venomous. In German stories, specifically, the cave worm or lindworm was especially terrifying. There was the seven-headed serpent and Nidhogg, whom I mentioned already, but there was also the unnamed serpent that slays the mighty Beowulf. Now, to be clear, dragon myths existed all over Europe. They actually go as far back as ancient Mesopotamia. But I want to focus more on the German tales, since lindworms figure pretty predominantly into their mythology. There was Jormungandr, for example, who was the middle child of a giantess and the god Loki, according to Dragonica.com. Odin took Jormungandr and threw him into the great ocean that surrounds Midgard. The Midgard serpent was so greedy that he ate everything in the water, continuing to grow and grow until he was so monstrous he could circle the earth. To this day, Jormungandr clasps his own tail in his mouth, continuously hugging the earth. And if he ever lets go, Ragnarok will be upon us. And there's also Fafnir, the Embracer. Fafnir was once from the race of dwarves, but he was very, very greedy. He was so greedy that he killed his own father in order to take the great treasure that was given to his father by the god Odin. Fafnir escaped to the forest caves with this treasure, which he guarded day and night. Over the years, his constant guarding turned him into a lindworm. If this sounds familiar, it probably should. Some scholars believe that Tolkien used the Fafnir story as inspiration for Gollum and My Precious. Anyway, Fafnir's brother Regan, who was still a dwarf, plotted to kill his dragon brother and take the treasure for himself. So he and his foster son, Sigurd, dug a huge hole in the ground, and Sigurd lay in wait. When Fafnir passed over the hole, Sigurd plunged his sword into the serpent's belly. As Fafnir's life slowly drains away, he asks Sigurd who he is and warns him against taking the treasure, as it would only bring him death. Sigurd replies that a time will come for everyone to journey to hell. Regan then cut the heart from the dead serpent's body, and remember, he was once his own brother, and then he cooked it. The two men began to argue over who deserved the credit for killing Fafnir. Was it the mastermind or the one who actually did the deed? As he passed the roasted meat to Sigurd, Sigurd burned his fingers and stuck them in his mouth. As soon as he did, he was suddenly overwhelmed by the language of the birds, and he could understand 7 birds who were perched nearby. They told him that Regan planned on killing him next so he could keep all the treasure for himself. Figuring it was kill or be killed, Sigurd made his move and killed Regan first by chopping off his head. Then he eats Regan's heart, drinks Fafnir's blood, and then follows Fafnir's tracks back to a strange house dug into the earth and fortified with iron bars. Inside, he finds great treasures, like a coat of mail made of gold. He loads the loot onto his horse and gallops away. It's quite the bedtime story to be telling your kids.
I know. Well, that's what greed gets you.
Chop this one's head off, drink this one's blood.
Right.
In the late 6th to 8th centuries, Germanic helmets were frequently decorated with dragons. Usually just depicting a dragon's head, there are some examples where a comb extends down the back of the helmet like a dragon's body. The character of Fafnir the serpent is still widely known and shows up in popular culture all the time. Besides figuring into the Marvel universe, video games, and manga series, scientists have used Fafnir's name too. Most notably, in 1966, the Science Museum of Minnesota named their Triceratops skeleton Fafnir. And in 2015, the International Astronomical Union named a star after him. Obviously, most of these serpent dragon tales, and probably most dragon tales, even the flying, fire-breathing kind, are cautionary stories about greed. But lindworms, according to Dragonica.com, were blamed for things too. As I mentioned earlier, they were known to slither into churchyards and steal corpses. They might carry off a sheep or a cow, and in some cases, they could take a maiden or two. Now, I know I said I wanted to focus on German stories, but I do want to take a minute and mention the stolen worm, or Tatzelwurm, of the Bavarian Alps. The Stollenworm is also a lizard or serpent-like creature, anywhere from 1 to 7 feet in length. They might have 2 short legs or 4, but sometimes they are said to have as many as 6. They are also venomous and have poisonous breath. But where the Stollenworm really differs from the German lindworm is that they often emit a high-pitched sound or hiss, and they also have the head of a cat. And people were claiming to still see them in the 17th century, all the way up to 1814. In the 1600s, brothers Hans and Thomas Tinner were on Frumsen Mountain. Locals had been complaining about their cows and how they seemed to be sucked dry by some sort of unknown creature. The brothers spotted a 7-foot-long, cat-headed serpent with a black-gray body. They were sure that it was some sort of serpent because it didn't have any legs. Once they killed the creature, the problem with the cows went away. In 1660, a man named Andreas Roduner was on Mount Vongersberg in Zarjanserland when he came face to face with a cat-faced mountain dragon. He said it reared up on its hind legs and was as tall as any man. It also had boar-like bristles running down its back. I have to say this one sounds more classic dragon-like rather than serpent-like, but I liked his description and that he called it a cat-faced mountain dragon.
Yeah, he should have thrown it a ball of yarn. It probably would have ran after it and he could have just got away. Throw down some catnip.
Before the end of the 1600s, Johannes Buehler of Senwald Parish claimed to have encountered a stolen worm that had 4 legs and the body of a lizard. 70-year-old Johannes Egerter had a similar encounter on Mount Kamor. The beast had an enormous head and 2 front legs, but otherwise was entirely dragon-like. When it breathed towards him, the man said he felt dizzy. The 1700s brought even more mountain encounters, like Hans Fuchs, a farmer who ran into his house one day in 1779 and told his family he had seen 2 Stollenworms. They were 5 to 7 feet long, with long serpent bodies, 2 front legs, and feline heads. He was so frightened he died of a heart attack just seconds after telling them.
Poor Hans fucks.
I knew it. I knew you were going to say something.
The poor guy.
It's terrible.
I feel for Hans fucks.
Did you notice how when I was saying that part, I kind of sped past his name without taking a breath because I knew you would comment on his name?
It has a certain ring to it.
Two folklorists, Samuel Studer and Johann Rudolf Weiss, gathered as many Stalin worm stories as they could find in the early 1800s. Most of the anecdotes they collected were pretty similar to the ones I've already told you, but they added to the lore by saying that Stalin worms generally come out in humid weather or when it's about to get stormy. They were definitely poisonous and best avoided. Studer published his book in 1814 and generally seemed to believe the stories, even going so far as to offer reward money to anyone who could bring him a specimen. Weiss, on the other hand, wasn't convinced, and although he collected stories, he thought of them as just that, stories. He thought all of the encounters could be explained by mountain cats and snakes. But let's go back to the Balkans for a moment, where we started. A lot of the stories I shared were German in origin or Norse, and Norsemen did travel to the Balkans. Right about now, I should probably tell you that the creature I described at the beginning of my story, the little dragon baby with the pink skin and the serpent body and the weird frills, well, they really do exist in caves in the Balkans. They're called Wyrms, and they're native to the entire Balkan region, but especially Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia. Recently, populations have made their way to Italy. And 400 years ago, when heavy rains washed dozens of Wyrms up from their cave homes, people really did think they were washed-up dragon babies. What they are cave salamanders, similar in appearance to an oxalotl or a mud puppy.
They are pretty freaky looking.
They are, and they do look like baby dragons.
They really do.
Their bodies are snake-like, and they grow to be about 8 to 12 inches long. Due to their underwater cave environment, their skin is generally pale pink or white. They have eyes, but they are so recessed into their heads that they are essentially blind. They have an excellent sense of hearing and smell, though. Their legs are tiny, and they have just 3 toes on their front feet and 2 toes on their back feet. They swim like an eel. Their tails, which are short and flat, have a little fin running down it, and their little mouths are full of little teeth, which they use to eat just about everything, from shrimp to snails to insects. Although they don't actually use their teeth to chew their food, they just swallow everything whole. But constantly eating isn't an issue either, because they don't have to. Wyrms in captivity have gone as long as a decade without eating anything. They can live for up to 70 years, and they also breathe through external gills that really do look like dragon frills. Despite how I've described them, they're kind of cute in a slimy, mud puppy kind of way. But I can, like we said, 100% see why anybody would think they are baby dragons, because they totally look like baby dragons. They don't have the head of a cat, but they certainly do look like the offspring of your typical classic scale-covered winged fire-breathing dragon. And researchers wonder if they could be the origin animal for many of the myths and legends. So that's pretty cool. I mean, they aren't really dragons, but they are the badasses of the salamander world. And they may have inspired thousands of years of stories.
Well, who doesn't like dragons?
I know, they are the coolest mythical creature out there, with wings.
Yes, they are. And here's the thing. Where did they originate from? I mean, who came up with the appearance of what a dragon looks like?
It's a good question, because they all seem to
look like one another.
And all the cultures around the world have dragons in their mythology.
Right.
Right.
That's something we're going to have to research next.
I know.
Well, we'll be right back after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? Female European common frogs have developed some interesting ways to thwart male frog advances. First, they will emit a male frog sound to confuse their lusty mate into thinking he accidentally picked another male frog. If that doesn't work, female frogs have been known to play dead for several minutes until their unwanted paramour loses interest and gives up. I guess you gotta do what you gotta do when you can't say, "Sorry, honey, I have a headache." Who'da thunk it? All right, we're back, and I am really excited about your topic tonight, so I'm just gonna sit back and let you get started.
Well, I have to say that I'm willing to bet that all of you out there that are listening to this episode, at least our American listeners, have heard of the Stanley Hotel. You probably all had instant visions of Jack Nicholson in your heads, chopping through the door, poking his head through the splintered hole, and snarling, "Here's Johnny." Well, we all know the cultural reference, at least to those of a certain age do. And I think it's pretty fair to say that the Stanley Hotel will be forever linked to The Shining. But the Stanley Hotel is much more than just an exterior shot in a classic horror movie. That's right, you may not know this, but the movie The Shining wasn't actually filmed inside the Stanley. Scenes for Dumb and Dumber were, though, and Jim Carrey stayed in room 217. But we'll get to that in a bit, because I want to emphasize that the Stanley is much more than just a setting for a movie. The hotel has a pretty interesting history, and to this day is still visited by thousands of paranormal enthusiasts hoping for a paranormal experience. Between 1872 and 1884, Lord Dunraven, an Irish aristocrat, claimed 15,000 acres of Colorado's Estes Valley during the Homestead Act of 1862. He had hoped to turn the park into a private hunting preserve, but when local reactions were less than friendly, Lord Dunraven decided it wasn't the best idea and left all of his land in the hands of an overseer in 1884. Estes Park is beautiful. At an elevation of 7,522 feet, it's known as the base for the Rocky Mountain National Park, with its stunning mountain views, abundant wildlife, and popular outdoor activities. Freeland Oscar Stanley, the owner of the Stanley Motor Carriage Company, fell in love with the area when he arrived in Estes Park in 1903. Stanley, who invented the steam-powered car, had been stricken with tuberculosis and had come to Colorado on the advice of his doctor. Fresh breathing air and a hearty diet would do him some good. He and his wife Flora arrived in June of that year. Unlike many who suffered from TB, the Colorado air did do him some good, and Stanley actually recovered. Vowing to return every year for the rest of his life, Stanley did just that, until 1907, when he decided that Estes Park should be a resort town for everyone suffering from TB. He would build the most luxurious hotel and sanitarium known to man, so people seeking medical treatment and the restorative air would have a place to come. But it would also be an elite luxury resort for all the moderately wealthy East Coasters like him to come and stay. In 1908, he purchased the land from Lord Dunraven, and construction began on his 48-room Colonial Revival-style Grand Hotel. The main building and nearby concert hall were completed by 1909 at the cost of about $500,000. The entire hotel was wired for electricity, and in order to ensure that it would always work properly, Stanley had the Fall River hydro plant built. Initially, the main building had large picture windows, curving staircases to promote airflow, and light-colored walls to reflect the sunlight. Every public space included French doors that could be opened to invite a cross breeze. There was a music room and a drawing room for the female guest and a smoking lounge outfitted in dark leather chairs, granite fireplaces, and paneled in dark stained wood for the men, as well as a billiards room. Stanley himself did not smoke or drink, but he did love playing pool. Every single guest room had its own telephone, and every 2 rooms shared a bathroom with running water, making the hotel a true lap of luxury. The separate concert hall was designed and built by Henry Lord Cornwallis Rogers to slightly resemble the Boston Symphony Hall. Legend has it that Stanley had the concert hall built specifically for his wife Flora as a gift, and originally it had a bowling alley under the stage. At first, Stanley did not know what to call his hotel. He wanted to name the hotel after Lord Dunraven, but when he suggested the name and word got out, 180 locals signed a petition on a piece of buckskin saying he'd do better to name it after himself. To get guests from the train station in Lyons, Colorado to Estes Park, Stanley produced several specifically designed steam-powered cars that he called mountain wagons. Each one could transport several guests at once. The hotel was a huge success, pulling in thousands of guests. There were those who came for a relaxing getaway and those who came to try and recover from their lung disease. In 1911, however, disaster struck. Several papers ran articles about the accident, and each one added new details that were different from the next. Over the years, the story has been retold and added to, making it even harder to separate fact from fiction, but I'll do my best. Despite being powered by the hydro plant, Stanley also had a backup gas lighting system installed. On June 25th, a gas leak caused an explosion that ripped through the second floor of the hotel, destroying 10% of the building. Witnesses said it was so powerful that a bathtub came sailing out of one of the rooms. At least 8 people were injured, 7 waiters and 1 hotel maid named Elizabeth. It's Elizabeth's story that seems to be the focus of all the embellishment. Even at that time, the papers referred to her by 2 different names, Elizabeth Wilson and Elizabeth Lambert. Some said that she had lit the lamps on the second floor because she was preparing for a summer storm. Some say that the blast threw her from the second floor to the first floor. Later retellings put the blast in winter before a snowstorm. Elizabeth was injured. She suffered 2 broken ankles, but luckily no one was killed. Stanley began rebuilding right away, and over the next few years, the hotel property grew to 11 buildings, including the 140-room main hotel, the concert hall, a carriage house, manager's house, gatehouse, and the lodge, a smaller bed and breakfast originally called the Manor House. Although the hotel was a massive success, Stanley wasn't the best manager, often treating the hotel as a place that he liked to spend time at, but not necessarily run. By 1926, he sold the hotel to a management company, but 3 years later, in 1929, he was forced to buy it back out of foreclosure. A year later, he sold the property to Roe Emery, a Denver hotel magnate. The Stanley Hotel was only open in the summer months and shut down each winter, even during Stanley's ownership. But after 1930, the hotel just didn't bring in the same amount of business as it used to. In fact, the hotel was on the verge of closing for good when a young author and his wife showed up on the last day of the season in 1974. It's been said that Stephen King saved the Stanley, although I'm sure that's not something he thought of when he stayed there for just one night. King himself has told the story of his overnight stay differently each time that he's been asked about it. Sometimes he says that he went down to the bar for a drink in the middle of the night after having a horrible nightmare about the death of his son. He said that the bartender's name was Grady. Other times, he's talked about the isolation and the eeriness of being the only two guests in such a massive hotel, eating alone in the massive dining room and walking through the empty hallways. And lastly, he's mentioned pulling back the pink shower curtain in his room's bathroom, staring into the tub and thinking, what if someone died here? They stayed in room 217. One thing King has never ever said he had at the Stanley that night was a paranormal experience. And yet, with the publication and then film version of The Shining, the Stanley Hotel became instantly known as the most haunted hotel in the country. And not by just one ghost, by at least 9. And there are at least 5 paranormal hotspots in the hotel, including the infamous room 217. So I'm going to start us off with some of the general areas in the hotel. The main staircase has been nicknamed the Vortex for years, because over the years, paranormal investigators, regular guests, and employees have come to believe that the staircase itself is some sort of portal that allows spirits to wander in and out of the hotel. The staircase does seem to be the best spot in the hotel to snap photos that may end up including the images of people who weren't in the shot. One famous example is the little blonde girl from 2018. The photographer was looking over the railing at the ground floor when they took the picture, and it clearly shows the back of a little blonde girl wearing what looks like a white nightgown at the top of the stairs leading up from the lower floor. She's completely blurry as if she's moving, as well as another woman with a couple of children on the stairs who are also walking down the stairs and are completely blurry. But the photographer insists that the little blonde girl was not actually there at the time. Then there's the most recent photo of the woman in the black evening gown at the top of the stairs. The dress that she's wearing is such a classic style that it could be from any decade, but she also appears to be wearing a hat from the early 1900s. The hotel's bar is named the 217 Wine Bar, and it's where the music room once was. The hotel pays homage to the history by keeping a 7.5-foot Steinway piano in the room that once belonged to Flora Stanley. Apparently, guests and employees have heard someone playing the piano when no one else is in the bar. Sometimes when people have tried to play the piano, the cover will come down on their fingers. They also hear piano music coming from the concert hall that they just can't explain, which many people attribute to Flora's spirit. But it could also be Paul or even Lucy. According to TripSavvy.com, Paul was a former handyman who was also responsible for maintaining the hotel's 11 p.m. curfew. Paul has been said to make his appearance known in the concert hall by bothering workers who are there to do repair work. For example, one worker who was there to sand the floors claimed that something or someone kept nudging his foot while he worked. Others have claimed to hear a man's disembodied voice tell them to get out when they've stayed beyond 11 p.m. The story of Lucy has been retold and embellished as much as the gas explosion of 1911 or Stephen King's visit. Allegedly in 1996, when the concert hall was in dire need of restoration and repair, a homeless woman named Lucy went inside for shelter. Some versions say that she was a former employee who was down on her luck. But regardless, the story goes that Lucy froze to death inside the concert hall, and her body wasn't discovered until new owner John Cullen purchased the hotel that year. Now, I think it's fair to say that by now, all of you listeners out there know that I like to confirm these types of stories, especially when they sound more like urban legend than fact. And I have to say that I tried every search that I could possibly think of, and I didn't come across a single article about a woman being found frozen to death at the Stanley in 1996. And with that said, you would think that it would be out there somewhere if it had truly ever happened, since that's kind of a big deal. So then I looked for any deaths in Estes Park in 1996, and although there were several, of course, none of them seemed like a possible origin for the Lucy story. So with that said, I can't confirm the Lucy story. But paranormal investigators have claimed to have communicated with a young woman named Lucy in the concert hall. The fourth floor of the hotel was originally used for just storage, but was later converted into apartments for female employees and their children, and then later into guest suites. Imagine being a child and having the Stanley as your home. It must have been a lot of fun to run up and down those corridors and play hide and seek in that massive hotel. A lot of the general paranormal activity on the fourth floor does sound a lot like the antics of ghost children. Guests who are staying on the fourth floor often complain about the unruly kids that they keep hearing laughing and running up and down the halls. Closet doors open and shut on their own, and guests will put items down, walk away, and then can't find them when they come back. After searching, they find the items inside dresser drawers. All of that does sound kid-like, but it isn't a child that's said to haunt rooms 401, 407, or 428. Room 401 also has a closet that opens and shuts on its own, but the room doesn't have a fun childlike feeling to it. According to UncoverColorado.com, guests that stay in room 401 have reported the feeling of being watched by a male presence. Female guests have claimed that something touched them inappropriately when they've been putting their clothes away or taking them out of the closet. One male guest claimed that after putting his wedding ring down on the bathroom counter, he watched it slide across the counter and then fall into the sink and down the drain.
That'd be a fun one to try and explain to your wife. Sorry, honey. A ghost took my wedding ring. Or, it's a good cover story if you lose your ring. Hopefully she was there and she saw it happen too.
Well, that would definitely be a sticky situation to be in.
Yes. No matter how you slice it, that's a tough one to explain.
Yeah. You might be sleeping in another room entirely after that.
Yeah.
Room 407 seems to have two different types of energy, but it could be one entity trying to get the living's attention any way they can. U.S. Ghost Adventures refers to this entity as an enraged Irishman, and that employees have nicknamed him Lord Dunraven, the man Stanley bought the land from. First, guests have experienced the sensation of someone sitting on the end of the bed, which is pretty unnerving. But then they've also claimed to feel as if someone is trying to tuck them in. They've also felt as if someone is watching them from the corner of the room. Lights are known to flicker in the room with no explanation, and at times, guests have felt as if someone has pulled their hair. But Room 428 seems to have the most activity of all the rooms on the haunted 4th floor. Allegedly haunted by the spirit of ladies' man Rocky Mountain Jim Nugent, guests have claimed to hear the friendly cowboy walking over their heads and moving furniture around above them. This, due to the slope of the roof, is impossible. But Rocky Mountain Jim is said to also pay visits to room 428 itself, to stand at the end of the bed or even sit on its edge. He's also been known to press cold lips against female guest faces as they lie in bed. Rocky Mountain Jim was quite the character in life. He came to Estes Park around 1868 and worked as a trapper and guide. He was attacked by a grizzly bear in 1869 and lost an eye during the ordeal. When Lord Dunraven arrived in the park, Rocky Mountain Jim was greatly opposed to the Earl's hunting preserve plans. But local rancher and Rocky Mountain Jim's rival, Griffith Evans, supported it. Now, it didn't help that Rocky Mountain Jim allegedly had a thing for Evans' teenage daughter. He was shot and killed outside Evans' ranch house on June 19, 1874. And with that said, now I'm going to bring us to the room I'm sure everyone has been waiting for, room 217, the room made famous by Stephen King. Back in 1911, the gas explosion was said to originate from 217, when Elizabeth the maid ignited the inferno with a candle as she tried to light the gas lamps. After the accident, Elizabeth returned to work at the Stanley until 1950. She passed away at her home at the age of 90. But many believe that she still comes to work every single day at the hotel and focuses much of her attention on room 217, making sure her married guests are comfortable and her unmarried guests are not. Married guests could be lying in bed in the morning, still trying to squeeze out the last few moments of sleep, when they feel the sensation of someone trying to make the bed while they're still in it. Or they wake up in the morning to this unsettling sight. The room is somehow tidier than it was when they went to bed.
That's not a bad thing.
No, I wouldn't mind that at all. Sometimes their clothes are even neatly folded when they knew for sure that they left them in a heap the night before. Lights are known to turn on and off in the room as well. But if you're not married and you stay in room 217, well, you might not be welcomed by Elizabeth. Unmarried guests have reported feeling as if an icy cold wedge has forced its way between them in the bed. One man even claimed that he woke up to his suitcase being completely packed and sitting outside the hotel room's door. As far as hauntings go, room 217 doesn't sound all that scary. It actually sounds rather nice. But if you want a bit of a fright, the hotel does keep an entire library of Stephen King novels in that room. And lastly, I have to mention that the Stanley Hotel has its own pet cemetery, and apparently a ghost dog named Cassie. Cassie was a golden retriever, and allegedly she can still be heard scratching at the hotel doors. And when rolled up newspapers are found on the hotel floor, it's natural to think that Cassie may have something to do with it. So there you have it, everyone, the Stanley Hotel. Oh, and let's not forget, I had mentioned something earlier about Dumb and Dumber. When Dumb and Dumber was actually filmed inside the hotel, actor Jim Carrey spent the night in room 217. However, we may never know how his night went, since whenever he's publicly asked about it, he's refused to say anything about it. Reportedly, he only spent one night in the hotel, and he said that he would never stay in that room again.
But we'll never know for sure.
If I ever met Jim Carrey, that'd be the one question I would ask him. What was your experience in room 217?
It's a good question to ask, although I don't see why he would tell you.
Why not?
Well,
I'm a nobody. those are the kind of people you tell things to. Because they're not, who's going to believe them anyway?
You have a point there. Okay, that makes sense.
It's not like I'm going to put it on TMZ or anything.
Right. You know what I find really interesting is that because of The Shining and because of Stephen King, Room 217 has taken on this, like, otherworldly, oh my gosh, it's so haunted, scary kind of persona is not the word because it's not a person, but like this ambiance that everybody thinks it's this horrific room, when in fact it's like the least haunted of all the places at the Stanley.
Right.
And the haunting that goes on in there sounds pretty tame.
It does sound pretty tame. Well, unless you're unmarried.
Right. And then you just have to keep your distance from your partner while you're in the room.
Yeah. I don't know. I'd stay in it.
I would too. And, you know, the reason I'm so glad that you did the Stanley was because for me, like, I've seen The Shining and we've seen documentaries on The Shining. But as far as the actual hauntings go at the Stanley or the history of the Stanley, I didn't really know anything.
Yeah, and you wouldn't unless you did some research on the Stanley.
Well, that's why everybody has us.
Yeah, that's true. Because I think most people think of the Stanley and the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And they've heard the hauntings, but really you got to kind of delve into it, read them for yourself and see what kind of makes sense and doesn't.
Right. Like the Lucy story. I mean, they're supposedly communicating with somebody named Lucy in the concert hall.
Right.
But you said you couldn't find any evidence of anyone dying in such a manner at the hotel.
Right.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. Well, I guess none of us will ever know unless we spend some nights at the Stanley and stay in several different hotel rooms that are supposedly haunted.
And see what happens.
That's right. You know, you can't just go to a place once or twice. I mean, you really got to be in some of these rooms multiple times for something to happen, I imagine.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it would be pretty extraordinary to go just for 1 or 2 nights and have something happen, I think.
Right. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode, all you fellow wanderers. Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.